So who has questions? This gentleman here in the front. And please briefly say your name and your affiliation.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm Jerome Dehaneau from the Open University in the UK. This to you for the last presentation. It's just when you were showing, it's just out of curiosity, the graph with the net wealth of in Germany, was it? And the CO2 emissions. When you said that it was linked to the business ownership, so that everything happens at the top, but how is the CO2 attributed to each percentile? Because you could also imagine, you know, whoever buys the car is responsible for the business that emits in the production of the car as well as the consumption of so it's not necessarily the owner of the business that would to whom we would attribute that, but I don't know how you decide on that. But just curiosity. Thank you.
Hans-Jörg.
Thank you for this nice presentations. I have a question to the second presentation. You mentioned this production function, and you did not speak about economies of scale, but I guess you also have to exclude economies of scale in the model. I feel these are very strange models if you have to rely on a certain technology. And you argued you have to assume diseconomies of scale or decreasing returns of scale, yeah? Normally I've learned is a Cobb-Douglas production function. If you don't have constant returns to scale, something is left. Can you explain that a little bit? Because that's not completely clear to me. Then to Miriam, I have a question. I think it's really clear the super rich have much higher CO2 emission. However, what do you think if we take, let's say, some wealth from the super rich and give it to the poor? Probably the super rich will just continue to consume what they do, and the poor will consume more. That would be ecologically negative, so to say. What is your opinion about that?
Thank you. Özlem.
Thank you very much, Özlem Onaran. Excellent panel with really rigorous research behind every word you said. So there was a great overview of the work you have been doing for almost a decade or more in some of the cases for all three of you. So I have questions or comments on all of the three speakers, if I may. If I start with the order of the presentation is really exciting when you talk about robotization and the effect that you found on women's employment. I would probably do two more things around that. First, I would like to see a non-linear effect coming into picture. Basically, put robotization square maybe in that equation. It's simple. The other is really something that I have been saying. When we work with ratios, employment share of women in total employment, in addition to that, I would also really like to see the impact of robotization on women's employment and then a separate estimation on men's employment. The issue is, I want to know if maybe robots are substituting both men and women, just more so men. I don't now know from that estimation, and it's, I'm really very curious, so it's really a question. This is already done and dusted and published, but the data is for you to tell us next time you come here. So thanks for that. In the order of the presenters, moving to Ajit, I mean, I've been a great fan of all the work that you have been doing with modeling at Levy. And I liked the simple exercise you did to demonstrate the limitations of CGE. That was very helpful and learning exercise, and you know, great message that comes out of that. but obviously they have moved on from that sort of very simple framework to rather complicated versions of their household economics, where there's gender. Well, they call it men and women. They would never use the term gender, but there is different preferences, and there is investment, and investment in both human capital and other types of investment. So probably we want to engage with their full models as well, but still come at the conclusions you're coming. I think the message will be the same. But for me, the issue I would like to take with the mainstream models is the lack of demand as a determinant of investment, and how they always would arrive at full employment. And I know that you work with models elsewhere, with the SFC, gendered models, extended with finance, where there is a very active role for investment-led, demanded investment. So how would that play in our gendered version versus their version, where investment is just determined by savings, isn't it? So anyway, that's something to engage with, I suppose, in maybe if you write a paper out of that for Egypt, I would like to see that. So Miriam, thanks. That's really, again, a great overview of all the interesting work you're doing, gendering aspects of macroeconomics. In the work on wealth inequality, it would be probably very interesting to look at also different types of assets. So financial assets, land, and business, and how that is gendered. Because you did actually say it in your presentation that a lot of the concentration of wealth of men is due to business ownership. So how are the gaps looking like in the other assets? It would be, I was curious. Sorry, I did the bad thing of learning from my students and taking notes on my phone, and it went black, but yes. And obviously in your dance simulations, it would be nice to have gendered behavioral differences of workers and capitalists. I don't think anyone has really done that in the Kaleckian tradition, but you have the data for that. So you can think of different investment behavior of men versus women capitalists. In the limited work we did, we look at different consumption behavior of men and women workers, and the capitalist aggregated, but even that should be gendered. And last question, of course, you are talking about a paper about wealth accumulation. Then there should be probably wealth effects on consumption and investment too, in the model itself. Yeah, sorry, there was a lot of unorganized thoughts, but you can pick up the ones you want.
Okay, so I think the question covered sufficient ground for.
There was one other, but you will make.
We have several, more rounds later. Do you want to start, Is? Is that okay?
Should I?
No, you just. Speak.
Okay. So, Özlem, thank you so much for your comments. You are lucky because I intentionally left that set of results out of the presentation, but they are in the paper. Not the non-linearities, that is a very cool, because it was like bringing what I brought, what I found in the first paper to the kind of the second one. But in the paper, you will find different estimation for women's employment and men's employment. And what I found is that for female employment, once we use the GMM, we endogenize robots, we endogenize female labor force participation, the effect only remains for female employment, not for male employment. And this goes along the lines of a very recent working paper of publishing from the World Bank working paper series, that they found the same. Robots in this specific, I can only talk about this specific set of countries that I am using, I have data for. It seems that it's really driven driving female employment.
Do you want to go next?
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much for the comments and the observations. I'm not sure whether I understood the comment about the returns to scale entirely, but let me try addressing the concern by saying that the point about that part of the argument was to demonstrate that some assumption regarding returns to scale is required for the existence of well-behaved factor functions, de facto demand functions. So I consider decreasing returns to scale as the one that would produce well-behaved factor functions, but which, in my view, would not make much sense in a world with just male and female labor factors of production and a large number of households. So the alternative assumption is that of constant returns to scale, which then, as I pointed out, leads to the non-substitution theorem, breaking the demand between the preference parameters, which are crucial in the model of the theory to explain the gender division of labor and the distribution of income. So I think that is what I was trying to say. About something being left when there is constant returns to scale, I'm really not sure, because in the...
Decreasing returns of scale.
Oh, with decreasing returns to scale, yes.
I mean, my argument was we should not accept. Thank you. So my argument was we should not accept models which cannot include economies of scale.
Oh, I agree with you completely. I was just saying that for decreasing returns to scale, it's problematic. That's what I was saying. I would argue that there are increasing returns to scale, especially when it comes to things like childcare.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that definitely I agree with you. Yeah.
So
I was just trying to say, but that's then problems that raises more difficult problems for the theory.
Yeah.
If you allow, yeah. Right. But any increasing returns to scale within this theory can be adapted as a special case of the constant returns to scale technology with the parameter, right, with the scale parameter, like Romer and others do in their endogenous growth models. So it could be accommodated within this theory. The point about using more complicated CG models, I mean, see, what I was thinking, Oslam, was that a lot of times people, at least including me, when I was confronted with the CGE models, I had difficulty really understanding what is the economics behind it, I love the CGE models because they follow the accounting. The accounting is watertight with the social accounting matrices. We follow pretty much the same methodology as an empirical methodology. It makes a lot of sense. But one of the difficulties is that with this large number of sectors and then the large number of equations and then the large number of parameters, it really becomes a bit hard. The actual economic mechanisms become a little bit opaque. So what I tried to do was to use a very simple framework with the allocation of female and male labor between SNA and non-SNA activities, and what would the theory say in that context. Theory is not something that I would like to hear, but how do you have an explanation of prices and distribution of income within that framework? Is that possible or not? And my answer was no. So I don't know whether I can make, whether it adds anything to the argument if I say the same thing in a more complicated model. So that's one thing from the point of view of exposition and from making the argument. The second is that if you introduce additional complications, additional problems come with them. For example, if within this framework, if we were to introduce intermediate inputs, or produce means of production like capital goods, then a whole series of problems which was raised in the capital controversy, Cambridge capital controversy literature, that come into play. Again, challenging the rationale of using the general equilibrium framework as a framework to understand distribution and prices. So I don't know how far we can go with, complicating the model. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the questions. They're all very, very pertinent and lead to me to think a lot more. So on the first one, on net wealth and CO2 emissions, the approach is consistent. So it's allocating production emissions across the wealth distribution, right? So it's the total emissions allocated across the wealth distribution. Now, the question that lies behind this is who earns the capital income from emissions, right? Or formulated differently, who earns the wealth underlying emissions? And that is a valid question, I would argue, and one that makes sense to answer. On top of the question, who consumes the goods and services that are produced using emissions, right? It's just a different way of looking at the question. Incidentally, and we were just discussing this today in the morning, the excellent session on ecological economics, I truly think that when it comes to climate topics, very often we fall back on a very, and I'm not saying you are, but very often in general discussion, we're falling back on a neoclassical standard where we're just looking at consumption, whereas in our macroeconomic equations, it's very clear that y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Right? But now, all of a sudden, because, of course, of some lobbying efforts by oil companies, as is well known with the carbon footprint, we are just looking at consumption, completely leaving out investment, as if that was not part of our macroeconomic understanding. The same way, income, all of a sudden, we're only looking at income, but not at savings, right? We're only looking at the consumption, only looking at consumption, not at savings, right? As post-Keynesian macroeconomists, we know that income is split up into consumption and savings, but we're just looking at savings and ignore consumption with a carbon footprint and ignoring savings. And we also know that this has massive distributional implications. We know that the different savings rates from our theory, back to front, and we're leaving out the part that is concentrated at the top. So again, I'm not saying this is yours, it's just something I need to vent at the regular. And then the other part, the third part, why I think there is some resistance, again, not by you, but in general, of looking at wealth in general, is because it is at the root of our economic system. And that wealth inequality is so high and so stable and so unknown by the gut feeling, while we know a lot about income inequality, wealth inequality, that it's as high in high-income countries as the worst countries in the world regarding income inequality is something that very often we don't have sort of as part of our regular curricular training. And that, I think, is because, again, from a Marxist perspective, it lies at the root, it's the means of production that define it, and that's why I think it's so important to look there. Second question on redistribution. Yes, again, we discussed this today in the morning, started by two excellent papers by Martin Medilanis with Svenja Flechter and Alex Koshansky and Rafael Wildauer, who are working on exactly this topic. Now, what Martin and Svenja were doing is looking at country, within and between country differentiation. And within countries, you see exactly the marginal propensity to emit that in high-income countries, that is not universal, but that's a high-income perspective, is higher at the bottom of the income distribution, right? So that is why environmental taxes are regressive in high-income countries, right? Exactly what you were saying. However, I would have three answers to that, I would argue, simplistic view. First of all, we know that the types of wealth differ strongly across the wealth distribution. At the top, you have business wealth. In the middle, in Germany, that is until the middle, but in UK or other high-income countries, that goes a little bit further down, it's housing wealth. And the bottom, there is nothing, right? I mean, you have a car and maybe a financial account, but basically no wealth. Right? And so if you do distribute away from the top, it depends on how you do it, whether you redistribute ownership of firms, but that's not what is usually suggested in wealth taxation. Or so we are talking about, small redistribution. And there, if you build up the wealth of the middle, most likely what you're going to be doing is dealing with housing wealth. And we know how to decarbonize that, at least in theory. Right? I mean, that is something that can be done with construction, a lot of wood-based construction, insulation, all that kind of. That is not rocket science. The second argument I would have is on the dynamics. We know empirically that the top of the distribution has increased their emissions, while the entire rest in Europe certainly and also worldwide has decarbonized. So even if we sort of accept this the marginal propensity to emit sort of theorem, which I do think empirically we see, the other empirical data shows that, first of all, what is happening is that the rich are emitting more over time, and the bottom 90 to 95% are emitting less. And we also know that the type of consumption that takes place in the middle and the bottom globally now is easier to decarbonize. Because the very rich, what they do is they have essentially travel emissions from flying and maybe yachts and SUVs. So, and that is extremely hard to decarbonize. We don't know how to do that. Certainly not for flying, and also for the other aspects. Not on a global scale. Third point I would have is the political economy aspect. The more concentrated wealth is, the harder it becomes to decarbonize because it's entrenched in our economic system, and the incumbents have strong resistance. And we see the research on this very clearly, that there is very strong resistance to decarbonization of the production process and the consumption side. And that stems really, I mean, it's very clear which groups in society are refusing and supporting political parties that are refusing to do that. And that's like business, well, just to be clear about this. Now, the last question, thanks a lot for your suggestions, Eslem. I'm happy to discuss that further. I just wanted to make one point on the types of assets, because, of course, we've looked at this a lot. We do see some effects there, but they're very minor. I actually have worked on differential returns that would have fit here very well, but we don't see gender effects, and that's why I actually took it out actively, because differential rates of return based on portfolio composition, right? And we simply do not find gender effects there. So although we have this business wealth concentrated at the very top, it just doesn't propagate far enough throughout the distribution to show up in aggregates. That's how I interpret this. So it's business wealth concentrated at the very top, but this is, you know, very badly captured in our data. And there's really interesting qualitative research on that coming out of French researchers who have looked into this, but it's a concentration of business wealth at the top that is hard to capture with surveys, I think.
Thank you. No, that's fine. I've already seen more hands going up. Gregor.
Well, thank you. Sorry for skipping the line maybe, but my name is Gregor Simoniuk, and thank you for 3 very instructive and insightful presentations. I have a question and maybe a comment on your answer, Miriam, which is perhaps unfair. But so my comment is a little critical. I fully agree with you that we can measure emissions from various perspectives of the national accounts, so that's totally okay to do that. I'm not sure I buy the argument that if we redistribute wealth, that's somehow going to, that, you know, it's easier to decarbonize the wealth of the middle class because of the input-output structure of production, that you still need the emissions-intensive sectors that are owned by rich people to produce those final goods that are maybe in scope 1 and 2 emissions not so emissions intensive, but that's just a side argument. My main point was that, but it builds on that, is that do you also have data on what types of businesses men and women own, or mostly men own, and whether there's investment behavior by those few women that do own wealth that is maybe different and maybe more decarbonized investments, so that they build up the low carbon economy of the future more than men, which I wouldn't be surprised if they did. And can one do research on this? Thanks so much.
Thank you. There were questions in the front here.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Suha Morvite. I was interested in the different types of wealth. Ignacio Pinto, who's sitting over there, has done very nice gender analysis of wealth in the UK. I suspect it doesn't go up to the very highest levels that you're talking about, but what comes out very clearly there is the biggest gender difference is in pension wealth. Now, that might be quite different in Austria from the UK, but I would say that I don't know about the overall scale, but Ignacio can tell us, but I would have thought it's comparable to housing wealth. But the difference is that housing wealth is jointly owned and pension wealth is individually owned. I was also thinking about quite different paper, but there's been quite a lot of stuff done on intra-household saving behaviour. And in particular, pensions are often used for that. And there's a very nice paper whose authors I can't remember, I'm afraid, which shows that whoever has decision-making power within the household accumulates pension wealth according to as suits them. So that might be partly an explanation of different accumulation of wealth, but also might relate to the issues that you talk about emissions, in the sense that pensions might be more controllable in terms of where they are allowed to invest in terms of emissions. There might be more scope for policy with respect to pension wealth and with respect to business wealth.
Thanks. Who else wants to? Please. We either way, we take both questions.
Just a very short one. Even if it's males owning the wealth, what about the widows? Because I mean, they have a longer life expectancy, so I would somehow expect, at least still, I mean, it may change with the younger cohorts that also have different occupations and are kind of taking up bad habits by males, but at least for a certain cohort, the baby boomers, there should, at some point in time, some part of the wealth should then transfer to the females. And I was wondering why it does not show up in your statistics.
Business wealth is...
Yeah, I mean, is that because you have business wealth in there and it's, well...
It's inherited by the son.
Yeah, no, it's not. She said
Hi, I'm Deborah Nunes, Monmouth University. Thank you very much for a very qualified and interesting panel. My question is I've seen a lot of work on like growth and development and how it changes values for women, mostly from like modernization theory type of folks. So I'm very interested by your labor force participation and left versus right wing positions. I have a ton of questions. I'm going to make just two. First is, how do you capture that? Because if it's only through voting, you would, at least I would expect you to see radical left, well, better said, people that like to think that they are the radical left not voting as much, right? So you'd be losing part of that sample. And if it's like based on behavior or discourse, we are in this era that a lot of people like Naomi Klein calls the diagonal politics, right? That you see folks appropriating the anti-big pharma, my body, my choice stuff to be anti-vaxxers. Or you see trad wives appropriating the anti-GMO, anti-heavily industrialized food to be a stay-at-home full-time mother full of conservative values. So how do you see that?
So basically...
Let's...
sorry.
Did you have more questions, or what was that it? Okay. Okay, why don't you start these?
I just wanted to play. So we measure, we use this Likert type scale from 1 to 10. 1 is being leftist and 10 is being rightist. And it's we don't see whether they vote or not. They asked a representative sample every month, a representative sample from the citizens of Spain since 1993. In this political spectrum where you sit, I mean, where you are placed. So we use this, and then we have been doing different analysis, and we decided to capture what's your probability of being on the left, and we define being on the left as being 3 or less in the 1 to 10 scale. Using different cutoffs doesn't make difference. It's like 4 and less being left, or 2 and less being leftist. We see the same results. Of course, this speaks a lot to the tri-wives movement. That is, I mean, tri-wife movements who are full-time employees, I mean, full-time influencers working behind the scenes. So yeah, we also, I couldn't have shown this because still didn't allow me. So we have the evolution of political ideology for women and men by different labor market status. Something that is beautiful from our data set is that we have the differentiation between pensioners who never have been working in the labor market. This is only for women because the men who our pensioners who have never been working in the labor market for men, it was like 0.001%. It was like minimal. So we have that. Women who are pensioners never work in the labor market, and also women who have retired, who were working in the labor market and no more. Then we have homemaker women. Again, we don't have homemaker men, because it's like 0.00001%. And we see really that the difference between women and men in their political ideology comes from these women that are, and something that we have been, my co-author and I, we have been discussing a lot, is like the fact that you are within your walls at home, and you are not exposed to progressive ideas, feminist ideas, and you have not faced discrimination in the labor market, you remain, attached to these traditional ideas, so you are really on the right wing. Once you enter the labor market and you face wage discrimination, gender segregation, and many other things, and you are exposed, of course, those who enter in the labor market have a higher level of educational attainment. They might be graduated from college, they might be reading market output, for sure, so they become more left-wing.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for the questions. I'll start with Heike Jöpkes because it's easiest to answer. It's because we basically look at working age population. So we throw the widows out. Also because, yeah, in any case, we're happy to discuss and look at this further, but that's the reason. The second question by Gregor, thank you. I'm sure I'm very happy to discuss this further, but essentially your point could be taken as saying, well, there's no hope. Right? I mean, whether we distribute the wealth or not, it cannot be decarbonized, and that's it. I'm sure that's not what you meant, but that would be sort of a conclusion from that. And I would argue, well, look at the sectors which are still highly carbon intensive, maybe even going the wrong direction. I know it only for Germany, but I suspect it's similar for the US. You have transportation that's going the wrong way, and that is entirely policy driven, which is a huge, political economy issue and power of elites issue. You have energy, which is decarbonizing fast, by any means not fast enough, but really coming down tremendously. And we know how to do that. We know how to decarbonize energy in theory. We're not putting it into practice fast enough. But again, it's not rocket science. We can do it in principle. Not for the massive amounts of energy if we have no accompanying policies regarding reduction of energy demand. We cannot electrify our entire transport system, land transport system. We cannot electrify airplanes at this stage. It's just not feasible, at least long distance. So we will need some carbon catch and storage for negative effects, but essentially we know what to do with energy in theory. From a physical sort of natural sciences point of view. And the third one that I would say is an issue is construction. Here too, we will need some negative emissions, but if we move away from the way we are constructing right now, it is possible. I'm actually working on a research, or starting a research project with a PhD at this point, looking into the construction sector. So again, I think these big ones that I would see, and I'm again happy to discuss further, they're doable. And once you get over then the social sciences and political economy side of it, if you ever do, that is something that is doable. And for me, the prerequisite would be a redistribution of wealth and deconcentration of economic and political power, which maybe, it's a wish list at this point with everything going in the other direction. So I'm not saying this is something that's happening, but in theory, it's not something that is inconceivable and nothing we can do anyway, no matter who holds the wealth, type of thing. And what ties into this is I think that we have very strong democratic majorities for climate action if it's and with the determinants being if one is affected oneself, but if it's effective, and if the distributional effects are sort of taken into account. And I think policies that sort of touch these three bases have a very good chance of garnering democratic support. similar to how wealth taxes have democratic support, and there's no chance of pushing them through. So it's a power issue in my view, in large part. I mean, there is of course a lot of subtleties and a lot of inconsistencies in opinion polls on these issues, but I do think if one has policies that are effective and are perceived as such by the electorate and address distributional concerns, I think that would be sufficient for moving forward with democratic majorities. And then it's a question of political power and political will, and that is where we are really hitting the roadblocks. And then the last point, thank you very much for the question on pension wealth. We have actually looked at that as well. Of course, it matters much less, as you say, in continental Europe, because it's about capitalized pension systems. And even in Germany and in Central Europe, where we do see large differences, is indeed private pension wealth. And I think there's a whole story to that. There's also a lot of research on that because there's good data for the US, as you said. But the hope that pension funds would be sort of the drivers for decarbonization, it's, I think, similar to that ETF funds, and you know, because they're now looking at the entire economy, are sort of interested in climate change because the entire portfolio will be affected, and they have been disappointed again and again. The entire experience of the Californian pension funds trying to change sort of the shareholder value model and finding out that really what ends up mattering more is that, you know, the companies in which they're holding shares lay off their workers because their members, the owners of the pensions, in the end care about the returns to the pensions more than they do about the fellow workers' employment, I think is an example to that. So maybe we have some hope from that side, but I wouldn't bank on it.
Yeah, I'm good. That's all good.
Okay, so I think we can have a final round of questions. Who wants to ask a question? Please.
Thank you. I'm Aida Mirzai, Portland State University, Oregon. My question is for Karen. In regard to wealth difference, I have done some work on the US, on survey data. Can some of the differences come from risk aversion in investment? Based on our observation, women usually are more conservative, men are risk taker. So as a result, we are going to see differences in outcome. Thank you.
So this is your last chance to ask a question. If not, then...
Yeah, thanks again for the question. We have actually a PhD student here, Caroline Diller, who is working exactly, but I cannot see her right now. Ah, there she is. Right, so if you want to speak to her, please feel free. I can only repeat what I've learned from her. And that is, do correct me if I'm wrong. So first of all, the risk aversion measures that we have are deeply flawed, especially with gender respect. And the psychological literature has been very good in sort of trying to identify the difference in stated risk aversion and then actual risk behavior. And that's still in sort of controlled behavioral experiment type of settings, and the stated risk behavior, and you have very gendered responses in stated risk behavior. Again, Caroline, please do correct, like scream if I'm misrepresenting stuff here. But essentially, the way I understood it is that women say, "Oh, I'm really very, safe," and means, "Oh, I'm very, risk taking," and then once you actually, even in controlled in experimental settings, once you actually have them take risks, you find that these differences level out largely. And then, of course, there's an entire feminist economics critique of these risk aversion studies. By permanent authors, and I'm not going to stick out my neck because I'm not sure. Was it Julie Nelson? Yes, Julie. Yeah, by Julie Nelson, who's really criticized this this idea. And the point is, it's very gendered, and it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny.
I hope you all enjoyed listening to the three presentations and also to the debate as much as I have. So let's thank our three speakers. in due manner. Yeah, it's almost 8 o'clock. It's been a long day. I don't think we have to be ashamed of our workload today. So dinner will be served as yesterday, both in the restaurant and in the foyer. Yeah, enjoy the rest of the evening and see you all tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Well.